Welcome to the Cognitive Crucible, produced by the Information Professionals Association. Our website is information-professionals.org, where you can find links and information about today's conversation and get access to members-only content. Join John Bicknell and explore all aspects of our generational challenge, cognitive security. The Cognitive Crucible is a forum that presents different perspectives and emerging thought leadership related to the information environment. The opinions expressed by guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views of or endorsement by the Information Professionals Association.
My guest today on the Cognitive Crucible is Major Kay Nissen, who is the commander of the 2nd Audiovisual Squadron at Hill Air Force Base in Utah. As the commander, she oversees the squadron's mission to create effective audiovisual productions on behalf of the U.S. Air Force and Department of Defense. Kay Nissen, welcome to the Cognitive Crucible.
Thanks, John. Glad to be here.
And before we get started here, I would just like to let our audience know that Kay's opinions are her own and do not reflect the opinions of the Air Force or any U.S. government agency for that matter. So the conversation I'd like to have with you today, Kay, will cover your master's thesis while you were at the Army's Command and General Staff College, entitled Second Mover Advantage in the Military Information Environment. And I think our audience is going to really find this fascinating. But before we get into this topic, could we start by getting your assessment of our strategic landscape, or if you prefer, the times in which we live?
Yeah, I'll try and tackle both of those because I know it's been said by many of your guests before, the strategic landscape. From an American military lens, right, we have conflict in European Command and in Central Command, but our focus right now is getting ready for a fight in the Pacific. So I feel like from my perspective, we've been saturated in the military with great power competition ideas and thoughts and preparation for the last couple of years. And in the Air Force in particular, this past year, we've been starting to feel a lot of that change, right? So we've been thinking about this problem, and a lot of change has been occurring in the last year and is going to continue forward for the next couple of years. So when I see that change happening, the times in which we live is what I'm talking about. Is there's a little bit of an emotional and cognitive standpoint that we're seeing right now. So because so much change is happening for something that we hope never occurs, we're just in this big anticipation mode. And I think with that constant state of anticipation and ongoing change, it changes the way we think about readiness from a military perspective. When I talk to my airmen about what it really means, it's not anymore about your personal physical readiness or even logistical readiness. It's your mental readiness. What are we actually going to come up against? And if we're always waiting for something to happen or anticipating something to happen, your readiness state is always in constant flux. Depending on how you handle that. So that's kind of the times in which we live in for me. I get that sense across the force. I get that sense with my own airmen, and it's interesting, right? And
yeah,
I'm excited to see what happens next. And I know at the very least the Air Force will keep moving forward and adapt to what we need to.
Yeah, for sure. We didn't talk about this in advance, but I'm just curious. Now that there is some recent examples, and I'm thinking of Russia and Ukraine and that war that's been going on for several years now. Has the public affairs community drawn any lessons learned from what has been observed in that conflict so far that is maybe feeding back into, what you were just describing as far as the times in which we live and that anticipatory posture of, what the next engagement might look like for the U.S.? In any just broad lessons that you guys have captured?
Yeah, I know my research focused a little bit on this, but from the public affairs writ large, it's funny, PAOs always feel very connected when there's a crisis going on because you always know someone who's dealing with that exact scenario somewhere in the world, right? I have friends in USAFE, friends in UCOM, and no matter what's going on, you kind of are just sharing those lessons as it occurs. public affairs, we're pretty used to crisis mode, right? So we're pretty used to knowing how we respond, what needs to happen to best advise your commander. And so I think, yes, there's been lessons learned. I'm not sure that I have ones ready at the moment to share
Okay.
with you, but I know
Yeah.
uh,
Yeah.
certainly, we've been talking about it and thinking about it and seeing, did the way we released information, the way we talk about this, even just watching Ukraine and their national government respond to this has been illuminating, right? Just the way that they handled crisis and the way in which they shared information certainly gave us some things to think about. I'm not sure that it's
Yeah.
been codified yet, but
Yeah.
we've certainly been watching it closely.
Right. Yeah, for sure. Okay. So, one other little, like somewhat of a, well, no, it's related. So I introduced you with your master's thesis out of the Army Command and General Staff College. That's out at Fort Leavenworth, right? Uh, but in conjunction with that, you were a part of the Information Advantage Scholars program within that curriculum. Do you think you could just give a 101 real quick on what is that program and how was the experience?
Yeah, so Command and General Staff Colleges has two scholars programs, which essentially is just focused areas of studies. One is Art of War, and the other is Information Advantage. So I always like to view the Art of War Scholars Program as kind of your more history focused scholars program, whereas Information Advantage is a little bit more modern and current environment focused. So we were a competitively selected cohort, about 12 of us, coming from all facets of military backgrounds, cyber, space, special forces, infantry, public affairs, intel, information operations. Right. I think I hope I'm covering. Oh, one more, civil
Yeah.
affairs was in there too,
Okay. Yeah.
and it was just a group of us studying a lot of different blocks related to what we call information advantages, but really just like the modern terms of artificial intelligence, space, cyberspace, machine learning, cognitive aspects of all of this as well. So, on top of studying just like academic theory of the information environment and operations in the information environment, we would go out to the field. We would do field studies. We'd talk about people who are tackling these problems right now and kind of get their perspective on how you can join that academic theory with like real world implications. So it was a fantastic experience. I had a wonderful cohort, people who were just very motivated, representing the best of their career fields, and a great program director. I'll shout out to Dr. Peter Im. He's still heading that program right now, and I think they're getting ready to select cohort number 4.
Yeah, excellent, excellent. And to our audience again, a big thank you to you, Kay. Kay really led the charge earlier this spring of 2024 to onboard a couple of other different some of her colleagues out of that program she was just talking about, but the episode with Major Vince Michelle and Josh Keller, plus another episode with Mike Zakaria. Both of those episodes are because Kay was helping to manage all of that and help get some of her colleagues into the podcast forum. So thank you for that. And so this is maybe kind of like a capstone, right? You are rounding it out. So thanks for all that, Kay. All right. So finally, here we are, 10 minutes in, and we'll finally start getting to your study. Your thesis on second mover advantage. So what do you mean by second mover advantage, and why is studying this important for today's military practitioners to consider?
Yeah, so second mover advantage theory is actually an economic theory, and it's just the idea of having two businesses competing in a market for profit, right? And so there's this idea, and lots of research has been done before on, who has an advantage when they enter the market, if you're first or second, and how does one overcome a first mover to gain more profit in that market, even though you technically had less time to gain it. So I looked at that theory because it was something that I had sort of experienced from an information environment perspective and as a public affairs officer. So to just kind of back it up a little bit, when you're looking at, or when I was looking at what do I want to study for a whole year, what do I want to do my thesis on? I just thought back on my career of, points at which I felt like I had witnessed problems, right? So what's something I could solve? And as a public affairs officer, one of our tenets is to be a trusted advisor. That's like written in our doctrine. That's the thing you have to be. And I take that job pretty seriously. And I've been very lucky to have commanders I've worked with where you're in close proximity to watching them make decisions in crisis and exercise in all phases of competition and conflict. And so I always think back like, man, when were my most uncomfortable moments as a public affairs officer? And it's, of course, you're attuned to your boss and they're a little bit stressed or they're a little bit not happy with the situation. And almost always it was either an exercise scenario or a crisis. They feel like they're behind in that narrative information environment, right? That they've lost control of the narrative or that we're in this response mode and we don't have initiative and we have to, overcome this thing in the information environment because it's impacting operations. And so as a PAO, right, they're looking at you to be like, fix it, right? Right. Use your tools to get us back to where we need to be, give the guidance, give the advice. And so what I've noticed, is a lot of times either by exercise design or just the sheer fact of how crisis works is, you don't get to pick the point at which you enter the information environment, especially if you have ongoing conflict. And so a lot of times because of, like I said, either by design or just the scenario at hand, you weren't in control of having the initiative, right? You were going to be the second mover, which meant you were in response mode. And so for me, I wanted to study this because it seems like from our strategy and operational intent, the American military is not really trying to be instigators, not often, right? We're usually going to be in response to some adversary out there doing something that we're not cool with. And so by default, you're always in that second mover advantage or second mover role. And what I think I don't always, or what I, when I started this research, I was like, I want to understand that better, right? I want to understand how you actually create an advantage and what it really means to be in a second mover position and how you can maneuver yourself to be, at a better advantage afterwards. That's not always this like, I have to overcome this thing. Like maybe there is an inherent advantage to being second that we just don't understand right now.
That's such a interesting question to ask because as military leaders, I can't think of a single time where I've been encouraged to. No, I mean that's not completely right. I mean there's art and science to all of this, but more often than not, you hear speed, right? Speed, speed, speed. Do it faster. And for me, at least, that implies trying to beat the adversary to the punch. But you're turning that around a little bit and saying, hang on, there might be some systemic opportunities to think about not doing that.
Yeah.
There's a
you
question
touch
in
on
there somewhere.
you touch on a point for sure that's like, you're thinking in your head like, when would I ever, right? And that's the question. It's like, when would I ever like not want to go first, right?
Hmm.
And I think when I did the research, just like, looking at the doctrine out there's a reason for that. It's because our doctrine says like, be first, seize the initiative,
Hmm.
bias towards action, right? It's all there from what we train commanders to do, what we train military members to do is like, do not wait for something to happen, go
Hmm.
first. And so you really have to dig into, why does that exist? Even if you look at the principles of war, you'll
Hmm.
notice offensive is a principle of war, but not defensive, right? And when I kind of translated, first and second mover, and I was looking at maneuver aspects, it's like, okay, we have an offense and a defense here, right? A response, an initiative, these kinds of things are always in dueling mode. But I was very lucky to have a historian as one of my committee members who was reviewing my thesis, and he was kind of like, Clausewitz has some things to say about this, and
I'll bet.
uh,
I mean, I was just thinking, I don't have all of the sayings of Sun Tzu
yeah,
memorized. I mean, not even close, but I'm sure that Sun Tzu also probably has something to contribute to,
yeah,
there's the wise leader, sometimes waits, and all,
right.
things like that. I mean, you can imagine there's something from Sun Tzu along those lines too. So, uh, how might a better understanding of second mover strategies, change the way that we're approaching conflict, particularly today?
Yeah, so the way that I saw it was, I got to my major findings. I did a lot for my research. I did a mixed method approach. I did a little bit of an uncontrolled experiment to gather data, so a quantitative approach, and then also a qualitative approach where I looked at case studies specifically with Ukraine and Russia. And and what I found was we actually just need to look a little bit more at tempo. So when I set up my research, I was looking at time as like a physical marker, whereas because this is something we kind of focus on as public affairs officers, like if I respond in a certain amount of time, does that create an advantage, right? If I allow days or seconds or minutes, is there a sweet spot essentially of a second mover response, and you're going to overcome that first mover? And what I found was not really, right? The timing aspect was not really there as far as creating an advantage, at least in the way that I set up the research.
You
And
mean
then when I
you mean the timing, as far as a lot of writing in the literature on this aspect of timing operations? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, so when we talk about military operations, right, we have to sequence, we have to have tempo, we have to have like, how we're going to synchronize people together. And so like I said, when you look at the information environment, you're always like, when would I want to release information? When would I want to maybe even reveal information um, based on what's going on in the world, or just respond, right? Sometimes there's just hey, this guy, you know, absent of military operations, I'm just trying to set conditions. So I should respond in a certain amount of time because this person, this adversary or competitor just did or said something. And now, you're looking at the US military or just our spokespersons to just say like, hey, what's the plan? How do we react to that? What I found was the timing aspect, at least from a purely informational drive, it didn't really change anything. But tempo, I think, does. So that was a major finding for me, was it's not necessarily about how quickly you respond, which I think is a bias of ours. Right? You have to respond right away, otherwise
Yep.
you're losing. That's not necessarily true, at least from what I studied. But I think tempo absolutely has a lot to do with setting conditions in an information environment. So how often are you saying something? How consistent? And then what is the strategy of, how are you tying that information release to behavior? So when you look at information advantage and what the definition in doctrine, especially for the Army, they include relevant actor behavior as being one of those tenets that's related. And so I was also looking at that too in my research, where
Mm-hmm.
you're going to have tempo of information, how you release just content, but then there's also tying that content and the message to what do you hope to shape in the future, right? What is the behavior you're trying to align, either from an American public sentiment perspective or from a partnership sentiment, right? Or even adversary, right? Of course. Just how would they respond, and how do you hope to shape their behavior?
Well, this has been a dynamite so far. Okay, do you think perhaps you could give a example or two or something where a nation has successfully used some sort of a second mover advantage to achieve objectives?
Yeah, so I love this question because this is the one I always get asked in
Okay, okay,
when I introduce my thesis, right? They're like, so when has this happened in history? And I was like,
right.
well, I never actually did find that happening successfully in history, because the focus of my research was, constrained to a certain period of time. but I think it would probably help if I explain like what I was looking at when I designed my research, to answer this. But essentially, right, when I looked at this question about, how does someone create a second mover advantage? When would you want to, go second in a military environment? I wanted to look at this from both a data perspective, like something you could watch real world and like collect, timing, and then also from a case studies perspective. So I did a mixed method approach in my research. One side of that was where I actually watched people play a game, a cognitive game, where you're trying to convince one side to move a certain way and vote a certain way. The game's called Avalon. My thanks to them for giving me permission to use that in my research. But it's your standard game of 5 people, 2 teams, and you have to vote, and majority wins, right? Essentially to progress through the game, red versus blue scenario. So I watched this game, I think 30 times played out, and I just collected data from first and second movers. So essentially, if you talked first, I would time that. If you responded second, you were on the other team, I would time that. And the 2 things I was looking for in those uncontrolled experiments was the factors of response time and response type. So I kind of based my research based on this idea of, can you create a second mover advantage based on those factors, right? How quickly I respond or how slowly I respond, depending. And then the other one being response type. So I would essentially codify the way in which a second mover would respond to the first and say, were they confrontational? Were they deceptive? How can I break down the nuances of that response to give them an advantage? So that's what I did on that quantitative side. And on the qualitative side, I was able to compare a case study of Ukraine-Russia conflict that occurred in 2014. So that initial annexation of Crimea, what was happening in the information environment at that time. And then I compared that to what happened in 2022, where you had that further invasion of Ukraine, and it kind of felt like we started this war over again at that time. So comparing those information environments and then also looking for the factors, right? Response time and response type from a bigger nation strategic approach. So when I looked at those, I'll use the case studies as the way to answer your question about has this happened in history?
Yeah.
So when I looked back at Ukraine 2014, Russia essentially had the advantage in both information and, of course, operations, right? It was that surprise special operation event that occurred. We had feelings at that time because there were protests going on, there was instability. You could see public releases occurring where it's like, hey, we're just having trouble even establishing what's happening right now. And then all of a sudden that annexation occurred, and it happened so quickly that it almost felt like the advantage went to the first mover, Russia, because it was like, well, we didn't even really get a chance to respond, right? We could say, hey, we're not good with that. But at the end of the day, it happened quickly enough that they maintained that first mover advantage, right? And there was really no second mover advantage. When you fast forward to 2022, it was a lot slower the way that we played this out, right? We had a little bit more heads up on what we thought was going to occur because it was a larger invasion, just a larger military operation from Russia. And we were, right, declassifying intel, releasing it to the public, trying to convince people that, this is not a drill, this is real, and we're trying to release information to hopefully deter behavior.
This one of the memorable moments there was when the National Security Advisor got up at the podium and basically informed the world that we know this is getting ready to happen, or we suspect that this is getting ready to happen. And is that pre-bunking kind of a thing you're talking about?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So there was a lot of effort by the United States, right, and our national security apparatus and public spokespersons and all that, and intel, of course, everything that goes behind informing those information releases to notify the world, like, this is a thing that's happening and this is not a good thing, right? They were setting conditions of behavior essentially by saying, hey, if this invasion happens, that is not good, right? Like, very basic message, which was effective, but it played out over a longer period of time because we were waiting for this thing, right? This anticipation of like, okay, you keep saying Russia's doing this, planning that they're taking
Hmm.
actions,
Hmm.
that they're gonna, have a false flag operation to start off this event. There was constant calls with Ukraine and President Zelensky's team, I think, to just kind of be like, this is what we're seeing, you know, be ready. And when the event occurred, right, you kind of look at it and you go, well, was there an advantage? Because we started, the United States started first in saying, we see this happening and we're pretty sure, like, if we don't react to this, this is not going to be good for anyone. What ended up happening, because there was such a long buildup, was we had a consistent message, right? Violating sovereign territory is bad, right? You cannot do that. We should, rally to Ukraine if this occurs. And by creating that condition, you saw that, right? As soon as the invasion occurred and the military operation kicked off, there was no confusion about how to react to that event. Our allies and partners and everyone around the world was like, okay, that's not good because you've been telling us this would not be good for months. And I think we saw a much better reaction behaviorally just in aid to Ukraine in 2022 than what we saw in 2014, mostly because we were a little bit behind, like forecasting and shaping behavior to that triggering event. So just interesting from an information perspective, because it was like, well, technically we were first movers in information. And so we retained an advantage by
Hmm.
shaping behavior. But you go, well, the event still occurred, right? Russia, there's still a war going on right now, and they maybe were not successful in all of their military objectives. They did, they were not deterred in their progress and wanting to take over Ukraine. So obviously the fight's still on, but it was an interesting information environment when you kind of said, okay, if we want to cap this off, in this 9-month period, like where was the advantage for us, in the way that we entered the information environment and the tempo that we took. But again, that was a first mover advantage. It wasn't a second mover advantage. So
Sure, sure.
uh, yeah, so it's funny because I'm like, oh, my thesis was focused on, second mover advantages, but when I looked at the case studies in reality, it was like, well, we still see a lot of advantages lying with the first mover. And so for me, it's always just there's more research to be done. I've always asked people, it's like, if you see a scenario where you think that this is a very clear cut case of a second mover advantage in military operations, I'd love to hear about it. I've had some people share with me like their thoughts, but you really have to dive deep into the details, to understand, when did someone say something? How did we respond? When was it tied to, physical military operations versus just, that digital information environment that we're dealing in? So,
Mm,
yeah.
hmm. Hmm. Well, I mean, I hear what you're saying that, finding examples has been challenging, but conceptually, it makes sense that there ought to be some opportunities where second mover is the best course of action. And I
Right.
mean, I can imagine putting this into a combined arms kind of a framework, right? Where you're doing things that the adversary might not expect, or you're sequencing activities in ways that would favor your current force laydown, optimizing the authorities and the capabilities at your disposal. These kinds of things, but heretofore, it's something that is for operators to consider, more so than like here's where the Prussian army did this, here's where the Roman centuries did this, and here's where at the Battle of Shiloh the Union forces did this. um,
Yep.
but nevertheless, you haven't touched on this, but there's the classic, uh, uh, more of a longer term uh, application of this with the Chinese in technology adoption. Do you think maybe you could take a beat on that?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that technology adoption is almost classic case of your economic theory, right? Where
Mhm.
it's Why is there a second mover advantage created in products when you're creating technology or creating a new thing and entering it into a market? It's usually because you have the advantage of all of the research of the first mover. You take that research, you iterate off of it, you make it better, and then you enter the market fast, right? So a classic example of that economic theory is like Uber and Lyft, right? You see that battle kind of going on between which rideshare app is really the most preferred, but one came first, one came second. When you're second, you have the advantage to see how that product interacts in the market and what things need to be fixed. And if you can do that fast, you can create an advantage for yourself and essentially gain profits. So I think China is kind of using that model as well, right? They're able to take the research that cuts down on costs. And then if you're making the tweaks and seeing what needs to be adapted, you fix that too, and then you're off to the races for profits and all that.
Right, right. I mean, the concept of time and tempo really does seem to be a core component underlying all of this. I mean, not just in that the second mover advantage implies doing something later than the first, but there's I was thinking time more in the sense of like over the long run, consistently applying a second mover methodology can compound results as you go along. So if China captured technological advancements for just one thing, and then okay, they it didn't cost them as much time, effort, money, resources to develop, I don't know, VCRs, let's just say. Who knows? I'm just making that up. So just doing it once might not be especially beneficial, but doing it dozens of times, you get an effect which is profound. But I guess all of this is I'm just kind of asking you a kind of a to get your reaction to the possibility of some kind of a second mover uh, methodology where in a competition context or in a military operations, kinetic operations context, it might not be like a one and done kind of a thing, but numerous times across the battle space doing something which compounds over time. Do you kind of get what I'm asking?
Yeah, I think so. So I think there's this idea of like, what echelon are we talking about when you're
Oh,
trying to
yeah,
create a
yeah.
second mover advantage, right? So there's big national apparatus saying, hey, we're going to respond to the adversary in this way, and that's great, right? That has an effect cognitively on willpower of people on opposing sides. But when you talk about it tactically or even operationally, you're going to like, how well do I understand that real community or uh, land warfare environment I'm going to be in? Because just like in economic theory, different markets behave differently, right? So
Mm, hmm.
different areas of the world behave differently, different towns behave differently, and so yeah, I think if you're doing the idea of second mover advantage over and over and over again from tactical, operational, regional, you name it, whatever echelon you're operating at, you have to adapt to every single environment you're in. And it changes, right? It just changes over time. So um I think I get what you're saying, but yeah, essentially what's harder, I think, in this regard is what we find, especially if you're at that tactical echelon, and I was definitely counseled on this quite a bit from my army
Hmm.
counterparts. You certainly never want to be second, right? Like it's just such a bias against when you're moving, especially with kinetic firepower arms. Is if you're at that really localized level, it's hard to convince a tactical commander to wait. Um,
Yes.
right?
Yes. I
It's
can
just
imagine. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
There are
yeah, yeah,
certainly
yeah.
reasons for
You're
it, but
you're 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 advising the commanders. Okay, okay, boss. Hear me out. Hear me out. Okay. So I know that your boss and his or her boss's boss is saying, we got to do this now. But hey, hang on. Okay, check this out. Check this out. If we wait and then we do that, that's like, I don't know.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot. And why don't you go ahead and pack your stuff and leave the op center. So
Yeah.
yeah,
That's the hard translation point though, right? Because,
yeah.
often you're advising a commander who's used to physical consequences and not
Hmm.
necessarily cognitive ones, right?
Hmm.
And so, right, there's, as I think, I can't remember, it was a classmate of mine, but they said, hey, there's no advantage to being knocked out, right?
Hmm.
That's that
Yeah.
first punch, game over. So there's no second response in that situation, and I think that's the fear that kind of drives people to say, I'd rather be taking the initiative, I'd rather be moving first. I don't want to wait on my adversary to make a decision. Um, I think the hard part that we see with second mover advantages is much like if you're translating economic theory to this information environment, you have to understand the market, you have to understand the audience, the stakeholders. How are they going to behave in this environment when someone else moves, right? And how can you capitalize on that? Um, so
Mhm.
it's hard, right? I think that's why I'm really drawn to this problem and this research is because it's not an easy answer, right? I don't think there's a right way to do it yet, or even a trend that I've seen of, when does a second mover advantage present itself?
Mhm.
Um, I have a good group chat with my cohort, right? Anytime we watch something play out in the news defensively and they go, oh, hey, maybe that's a second mover advantage, right? They'll just kind of at me and they're like, okay, maybe that's a second mover advantage, right?
Uh-huh.
And sometimes it's tactical, sometimes it's operational. And you see these like anecdotal ways, but when you really start to pull it apart, I don't think we really understand what a second mover advantage uh, creation looks like. So I think we understand when someone, wins in this
Hmm.
theoretical setting of like, oh, they definitely are on top having gone second, but we don't know what drove it, right? We don't know why that occurred or how it occurred or if it was kind of a fluke or if it was just like, they got lucky this time. So that's why
Right.
I'm like really like I want to understand it more. I have a little bit right from
Yeah.
the
Yeah. Yeah.
research,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
this definitely needs to be researched further.
Right. No, it's an interesting dynamic to think about. I mean, my mind dwells on the the notion of energy expenditure and first, just back to the whole the Chinese and technological capture or technological leapfrogging. Part of baked into that economic consideration is that, not having to expend the same amount of treasure and resources to develop something and just, arbitraging the gains, I guess, really something like that, right? And so how can commanders um, compel energy expenditure in a way that um, can then be turned into the adversary's detriment. So,
Mm,
I mean
yeah.
that's not a new concept either.
No, it's not.
Do feints and distractions or deceptions or whatever that will prompt some sort of action for the adversary, and then the friendly forces can capitalize on you know whatever that outcome is, and that's kind of a second mover, I suppose, but it's also a chicken and the egg. Well, it's like, well, but then again, it's because you prompted that. But anyway, I have has has your group chat or any of your chats thought about that kind of a playbook or something?
I won't say in our group chat, but what's funny when you talk about a playbook, I'll have to get the link to you. But when I was doing my research, there was like one person that I found who was actually like, right, I did a little bit of a codification of response types in the experiment that I was running. And then when I was looking for just better options, I'm like, I feel like I'm not really hitting the mark here. I found a guy who had I think it's called the playbook, right? It's like a response playbook. And he probably went through like 30 different response types, response strategies, if you will, that would create different outcomes for, responding to an adversary in an information setting. And I thought it was fascinating. I wish I had the name top of mind, but I'll make sure to just give it to you for show notes. But yeah, I mean, playbooks, I think for sure have already been created. But I think what we run into as a problem is we have these theories, but we're not seeing them used in practice, again, because we're afraid to do that, right? We're afraid to go, let me wait and respond in this way, right? I want to do this deliberate response in a different way than how I've done it before, because I think this will actually yield a better result. But we're always going to be, wanting to respond in the ways we already know how, or to just take the initiative, or to just say, no, like, I'm just going to be safe about it because I'm not interested in creating a second mover advantage. I'm just interested in mitigating that I didn't have a first mover advantage, right? So it's kind of it's this is weird dichotomy of tension when you're trying to explore better options for military forces. And like I said, there's very likely someone out there who's thinking about this exact
yeah, no,
problem.
I was going to say it'll be interesting from the audience, just to ask the audience if anybody has any thoughts of examples or ways to exploit this concept in a way maybe that we are not doing consistently and that could become part of a more common common's not the best word, but like an occasional playbook where it makes sense. That would be really cool to hear about. And also along those lines, Kay, is your thesis publicly available yet? Do you by chance have a link to it, um, or do you know?
Not yet.
Not yet. Not yet.
Not yet.
Okay.
I'm in touch with the alma mater at Fort Leavenworth, but they're still in the review process right now.
Okay.
But what I can give you, I'm not the only person writing about stuff like this, so I can give you the link to the Carl Library's thesis depository, which will
Great.
include work from previous scholars. Right, it kind of gets published on a later time frame from our graduation, and so as soon as it gets published, I'll let you know. But
Okay.
at the very least, I can give you the link of where it will be published.
Okay, great. Yeah, so we will definitely include that in the show notes whenever it is available. And by the way, I don't know why I don't do this, but I should do it at the top. We're recording this on November 8th, 2024, so that those listeners who are still with us on this ride will be like, oh, okay, gotcha, November 8th, 2024, just as a marker. Well, fascinating work, Kay, thought-provoking, obviously. So, I think, getting creative about how we engage productively and compete and set the conditions for success and all of the above in today's environment, back up to your points at the very top of this discussion is so important. So well done, and to be continued, I'm sure, on how to think about the problem in this way. Do you think maybe we could transition and start closing out in our typical fashion? For students and researchers who are listening and wondering, how might I be able to contribute in this along these lines? Do you have a research question or two that maybe an interested student could take a crack at?
Yeah, so for those of you listening, I'm going to save you reading a 90-page thesis, and I'll give you my top major findings and where I think there's some potential research questions that come from that. So when I had my major findings, like one of the first things I found was the best thing you can have in this information environment game, especially with a second mover advantage potential, you have to have a cooperative partner. And we saw that play out in the games that I was witnessing, and we also saw that in real world. If you had a partner who was not understanding what you were trying to signal, you weren't going anywhere. There was no opportunity to shape behavior in a second mover advantage. So cooperative partners are key. There's definitely some more work that can be done in looking at like what makes a cooperative partner. What are the things that have to be available for that? Another one is we saw play out in the real world, but also in the game, that I was witnessing was consistency is needed, like consistency, like that tempo of and a trust and intelligence asset. So there were several times where someone goes, I have information, and nobody believes them, right? And we've seen this play out in the real world where it's like, cool, you have information, but like, why would I believe you? So conditioning trust is huge, and how we develop that trust in intelligence assets, but also just the public spokesperson apparatus is key to being consistent and being able to shape behavior in the future. We touched on this a lot in conversation, but information tempo, I think, is more key than information timing when we're going to create second mover advantages. So what does that really look like when you draw it out on a map and you're going, I'm going to sequence this, on a real plan? Got to be determined, right? So information tempo seemed to be something that stuck out to me, but I didn't research it that thoroughly. So another one was isolated variables. So I mentioned the two variables I looked at was response timing and response type. So how do I codify a response, and how do I time a second mover based off of the first mover? What I found was, in reality, you don't get isolated variables, right? I don't really get to measure timing in a war to the second or to the day or to the hour. We like to think we can, but that's never really the factor that determines success. So there could be other variables, but I'll just share that I didn't find that response timing or response type was quite where I needed it to be. And so if you're interested in this topic, I would say look elsewhere for variables that are going to have a big effect on second mover advantage. And then finally, response strategy is more important than response types, right? So we talked about this idea of over and over and over again, right? Every echelon having to create a second mover advantage if you're going to do this. So that's a strategy, right? Like that's not just a one-off. Well, if I do it this way one time, I'm going to win. But it's like, well, the war's not over, right? So now what are you going to do next? How are you building off of the success of a second mover advantage time and time and time again? And how does that fill into a bigger strategy? I didn't really get into it. I realized I was really looking super tactical, and that's okay, right? But I think there's a lot of potential and research on looking at what does a response strategy really look like when you're building it over the phase of an operation, specifically in second mover advantages. So offer that to listeners, and hit me up if you're interested in any of those topics. I'd be happy to steer you away from my mistakes and towards goodness for yours.
Yeah, well, that's part of the creation of the body of literature, or even the forming of doctrine or new military tactics. It's wrestling over this kind of thing, and doing research that has some interesting, like, new possibilities, but maybe also a couple of dead ends, or things that seem less fruitful, so that fellow research or follow-on researchers can be more efficient on continuing to pursue the agenda. So all very worthwhile. Finally, Kay, do you have a book suggestion that might be related to the kinds of things we've been talking about, or perhaps it's just what's on Kay Nissen's nightstand these days?
Yeah, I'll share just the few books I've been reading recently that I think, more for fun and just gee whiz than anything else. But, since I took command of the Second Audiovisual Squadron, I was interested in its heritage. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with, what is this squadron? It's, we create and transmit audiovisual productions for the Air Force and the DoD writ large. And why do we do that? Because we do hope to inform, influence, shape behavior, do things that are going to advance DoD missions. So in my preparation for command, I read a book called Rebels to Reels, which was about combat cameramen back in World War II, which really draws our heritage for our squadron. What was created way back when, to kind of get after some of these things we talk about from an information warfare perspective, was the first motion picture unit. And this was when you combined Hollywood industry with military, and you said, let's create audiovisual products, films that are going to not only inform the public, but also train people, help us understand the environment. And when you look back at, you know, archival footage of World War II, like if we didn't have those units, we would have much less understanding of like what occurred in that big, large scale combat operation that was World War II in two different theaters, right? So I really enjoyed reading that because it was a biography, a tactical account, but this man, Dan McGovern, who was who it was about, he did everything you could do, right? He was flying with the eighth over Germany on aircraft, filming, you know, bomber operations. He was also one of the first people on the ground who filmed and witnessed what it looked like in Japan after the atomic bombs drops. Like he ran the gamut of like what that world war looked like and documented some really important things. And it gave me a lot of confidence that like we still have this mission for a good reason. So Rebels to Reels is a recommendation. And then recently I it was kind of just on my LinkedIn feed, but No One Is Coming to Save You was popped up, and you know, that was a really easy read. I appreciated that it, you know, I just ordered it and it was like, you know, I finished it in a weekend. Great book about just the power of story, which is near and dear to my heart, near and dear to my squadron's mission as well. And so that's a great read as well. And I also think it, you know, it talks about a little bit of empowerment for the bottom up approach to getting things done, which, you know, sometimes it feels like we're in a world where the problems are too big for anyone to handle. But I think very plainly and succinctly, you know, the author there in No One's Coming to Save You just gives us a million examples of how we can do this ourselves, right? We can find like-minded people and solve our own problems. So
Is
I really appreciated that.
Yeah, I was just looking that up as you were talking. Is that no one is coming to save you, learning the lessons on becoming your own hero? Is that does that sound like it?
No, let me look that up.
It was by L.A. Harsh. Um, no,
I
that's
think
that's
it's a retired Green Beret
ah.
who wrote it. And let me see. A Green Beret's Guide. Let me see who is the actual author. So that Lieutenant Colonel Scott Mann. My apologies to Colonel Mann. I couldn't recall your name, but yeah, that's the book.
There it is. Okay, great. All right, we'll have a link to that. And I cut you off. I think that you had one more, I think.
No,
No,
that's it.
that's it. Okay.
I have a lot of books on my nightstand. I'm reading a novel right now by Paul Auster, and I just finished another historical book about the China Burma India theater. But if I'm gonna target it to the audience, yeah, World War II history, Rebels to Reels, and just an interesting way of solving an information warfare problem from a tactical look, and then Nobody's Coming to Save You just from an easy read, time relevant to the stuff that we're
Hmm.
grappling with today, and just a focus on story, which, like I said, I advocate 100%.
Right, right. And just to circle back again for the audience members who are still with us, a soft announcement here is that in 2025, IPA is going to be part of a conference. I don't want to tell too much about it just yet, except to say that. Um, it's going to be geared more towards the entertainment industry and sports and that side of influence. You know, the information professionals community tends to be national security heavy, right? A lot of government folks, a lot of military folks, and you know that's fine. That's just the way it is. But and so the conferences where people tend to meet up tend to be military focused conferences where you're talking about you know spectrum warfare and you know, hard and soft power, you know, military influence. But there's this whole other aspect of influence that you were just touching upon in your first book there with Rebels to Reals. And even though it's in a World War II context, the whole point is that the entertainment industry and sports and whatnot have their own versions of influence, which are very powerful. And just like you were thinking creatively about second mover advantage, and can this be parlayed into something useful for the military community? Likewise, how can the entertainment industry be leveraged productively along these lines as well?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Okay. Wow. Fantastic. Awesome conversation, Kay. Really appreciate what you're doing. Godspeed with you and in your command and your airmen. And with that, Kay Nissen, thank you so much for being a guest on the Cognitive Crucible.
Appreciate it, John.
The Cognitive Crucible is the only podcast dedicated to increasing interdisciplinary collaboration between information operations practitioners, scholars, and policymakers. To find out more about the Information Professionals Association, visit us at information-professionals.org. Please support our podcast by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a review.